We are in the 14th verse today, and really, I think we both mentioned early on in this study that James has not been a unanimous selection among the Reformed tradition. So especially Martin Luther, not a fan of the book of James. Calvin had some reservations, but I think voiced them less strongly than Luther did. Luther was probably the primary opponent of the book of James. And in today's reading, we really get to the heart of that dislike. And we'll try to explain. If you've been reading the book so far, you think, well, other than, slapping me between the eyes once in a while, what's not to like about the book of James? Well, today you'll see what it was that frustrated Luther so much about this book. So let's jump in here. Verse 14. Brothers and sisters, what good is it if you say you have faith, but you do not have works? Can faith save you? Let's stop there, Michael, just because that's a pretty good entrance. Now, I think we have to talk about this passage in two senses, and maybe the first is the frustration and division it caused in our church tradition. But then we can go back and just talk about what it says, maybe if we've couched it in those terms a little bit. So Luther's, remember, arguing with the Catholic Church, and Luther has pioneered this idea of salvation by faith, by grace through faith, and not by works. And this is Luther's fundamental argument that he's having with the Catholic Church of his day, who is arguing that doing penance and going to Mass and doing good works are all effective on they all have an effect on one's salvation. In other words, they have something to do, your works, with whether or not you're saved. And Luther is strenuously arguing against that. And then he gets to the book of James, and it says, what good is it if you have faith, but you don't have works? Can faith save you? And you'll see the implied answer is no as we go through the passage. And this is a significant problem for Luther, not only theologically, but this is ammunition that his enemies are then using against him.
Yeah, we may be detached historically from this conversation, and it may not have the weight or gravity that it had in that original context. So you have to recognize how significant of a argument this provided for Luther's opponents. Fundamentally, they looked at a text like this and they said, no, human action or human agency is in some way participating with God's salvific action. And that may not seem like a big deal, but if you're Luther and you're literally hanging your life on your reading of Romans, which was, in many ways revolutionary at that moment, that the grace of God is the only thing that saves, and the only amount of human participation that matters is the word that we use called faith. And faith is interesting because as Luther read it, as the Reformers read it, faith isn't purely human action. It's mixed mysteriously with the Spirit of God enabling us to believe. So not even faith is pure unto our own ability to do it. We rely on God to help us have faith. And so as we get to a text like this, if you say you have faith but don't have works, can faith save you? Luther wants to say, faith's the only thing that saves you. James, you're not helping me.
And keep in mind that Luther is saying that by and large as a new voice, and by and large to the one existing church that doesn't believe it. So Luther is trying to change really the known church of his day. He's challenging them on that very question, and this pioneering idea that he has, that he's encountered in Scripture, that we are saved by accessing grace according to our faith through our belief or our trust. And so here's James apparently saying something different. Let's continue with the text here. If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And here, and obviously entire books, entire shelves of books have been written over these questions, Michael, and we can't do them justice today. But I do want to suggest that maybe the primary way that the Reformed Church has dealt with Luther's unhappiness with the book is to, again, read James through the lens of practicality, and to say that James here is not engaging in the kind of theological work that Luther is. In other words, James doesn't understand that he's doing doctrine. He understands that he's describing what real faith looks like. And so this example he gives, if someone's naked and you say to them, hey, have a good day, hope things get better, and you don't do anything to help them, you can't say that you've acted in faith. You can't say that your faith has not moved you to care for them. You can't talk about what you believe independent of what you do. And so from a practical standpoint, we could read a verse like 17, faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And we could say, yes, that makes sense to us. If we claim to be Christian, but we don't do any Christian stuff, then that's not a living kind of faith. But when you try to push this verse through the theological the theological system of Luther or even Calvin, then it gets problematic. And I'm of the mind that what Luther is saying about faith and what James is saying about faith are different and therefore not incompatible. But there's a lot of thought that has gone into getting us to that place, and we simply don't have time to go through all of it.
Yeah, I can't help, Clint, but to read this from my own time and place. But realistically, I'm not entirely certain that these two are speaking opposites. And I think you might say it this way, that faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And what I think we can understand by that is not that the works work within us faith. It doesn't go the opposite direction. It's a one-directional movement. So that faith inculcates within us a transformed spirit. And that transformed spirit is then known by the external things that are done, by what we have here written as the works. That's critical, that you don't get to faith through the works, but that the works are a natural reflection or outgrowth because of the faith. And if you frame it that way, then God gets all the credit for the transformation. We participate in that transformation by belief, by faith, by trust. And then that mysterious participation in God's work then results in transformation of the human life, such that the stuff that we do is even a reflection of the person that came. And so I don't want to... one of the dangers when you talk about a study like this, Clint, is we smooth out the text. We try to get rid of the errors and stuff that seems to contradict other places so that it makes more sense to us. And I don't want to do that, to say that sometimes Scripture does have differing voices that helps us see differing aspects of God and what it means to be a person of faith. But I don't find this, as Luther framed it, as big of a deal as it relates to reconciling with Paul as the original reformers did.
Right, and we have generations of people who have thought through this question and helped us get to a different place. But I think we stand in a place now where most Reformed Christians can read this and not think that there is some kind of irreconcilable difference between this passage and, say, Paul's writings. And so I think we have gotten comfortable with the idea that what James does is slightly different than what Paul does and what Luther does. And James has in mind this very practical application of faith and the reality of hypocrisy. And what James is always going to attack is this idea that we claim something that has no visible bearing on our life, that we call ourselves something, but that there's no evidence of that. And James is always going to say, that's incomplete. It's not good enough. It is not. You don't get to define yourself as something when when your life gives no evidence that you actually are that thing. And so, and that's exactly where he goes. So verse 18, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works. And I, by my works, will show you my faith. And so, again, this is James saying, yeah, it's easy to say things. We preached this a couple weeks ago, Michael. It's much easier to say it than do it. It's much easier to call yourself Christian than it is to live like one. It is much easier to say, yeah, I believe in Jesus Christ, than it is love your enemies and forgive those who have hurt you and turn the other cheek and do those things that Christ calls us to do. And so James just says it here. Look, you can tell me about your faith. I'll show you mine by what I do. And there's a challenge in that and a wisdom in that. And then he says, you believe that God is one, you do well or good for you. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So essentially he's saying, yeah, anybody can acknowledge God, but acknowledging God and following God, obeying God are very different things. And Michael, I like James, and I it doesn't bother me that he sometimes gets the yardstick out after us Christians. I like the challenge of this. I find the challenge of this helpful, especially in our first world context where being Christian is fairly easy. And so many people are tempted to equate their faith with, well, I go to church, or yeah, I've been a member, or I believe this, or I believe that. And James isn't against any of those things. He's simply saying that those things are one part of a larger picture. And I think probably either tomorrow or the day after, we'll have to have a conversation about, does James mean the same thing when he says saved that Luther might mean or Paul might mean? And we can sort of flush that out. But here I think James provides a nice corrective to say, look, believing is not the same as obeying, as following, as being a disciple.
I think it's really important that we distinguish here, Clint, what the nature of the works that James is describing is. Because I think there is a kind of works in Christianity that we are tempted towards that look a lot like self-righteousness. The works of showing up to church, of making a life that looks good, of having the right stuff, of making the right choices, a kind of works that points back to us. Notice the works that James uses as an example here. It's the brother or sister who's naked and lacks food, right? The kind of works that is really exemplified in this passage is the kind of works that puts the furtherance and care of others in the forefront. So are your works done in such a way that others are lifted up and cared for? This reminds me a lot of Luke's gospel of caring for the lost and the least, the broken, and those who have greatest need. We've already seen that in our reading of James in previous studies. So I just think, once again, we see another example here of James saying, it's not just how you live, and it's not just that your work should reflect your faith, but it's not all works. It's the works that are demonstrating the self-giving of Christ, much like we saw in Philippians, that Christ gave himself for us. Are you giving yourself for others? If you are, that's a good sign for the state of your heart.
Yeah, and James is helpful in that sense of just giving us this nice reminder that faith and works, though we have handled them theologically as separate conversations, Luther argued the efficacy or the value of faith versus works. And I think we as Presbyterians at times put a wall there that was never intended. We got to the point where we could argue faith or works, faith versus works. And I think where James challenges us is to say, you from a faith perspective, they're not separable. they're not separate. You can't separate them. You can't talk about, well, I don't do the works, I have the faith. We have this doctrine of predestination and election in the Presbyterian Church that's largely rooted in Luther's thinking. And for a while, people even said things like, well, if you're saved, you don't have to do any work. You're already saved. You don't have to do anything. But when you think of it as a have to, you misunderstand the whole premise. And I think where James helps us is to say, look, faith and works can't be separate. They are both part of following Jesus Christ. The belief in our tradition is primary and foundational, but the works follow after it in a way that can't be disconnected from what it means to be faithful. And I find James really helpful on that point, Michael.
It's really well said, Clint. The only thing I'm going to add is it is quite a challenge to say that if you rely only on believing, you might be analogously compared to the demons. That's quite a challenging statement from James, is to say that belief unto itself is shared by the lowest creatures that exist.
Sure.
Believing must be combined with doing.
Yeah, you believe there's a God. Well, so do the demons, and it does them no good at all.
Right.
So, yeah, that's a pretty sharp sermon illustration.
Yeah, that's going to hit you.
Well, we hope that we didn't make that more confusing. If we did, give us another day. We'll be back in this section tomorrow, and we'll have a chance to talk through more of it. If we lost you at any point, post a question or send us an email, and we will make sure to circle back to it tomorrow. Again, we want to thank you for being here. We appreciate your time today and hope that there's something in here for all of us.
Thanks for joining us. 2:00 Central.